It's not the easiest thing in the world to bottle up lightning, and in the case of Midway in the 1990s, it proved almost impossible. The company behind Mortal Kombat knew they had one of the hottest franchises in video gamedom: violence, blood, or sometimes sweat. They were completely annihilating everything else on the market for a few years with a flawless victory. But internally, things were lacking. Aside from a sports title or a light gun shooter, they weren't as adept at mimicking their own successes when it came to fighting games. This was something, however, that Capcom excelled at, making dozens of fighters off the back of their initial successes within the genre. Things like X-Men, Marvel, Darkstalkers, Rival Schools, and of course, Street Fighter, the movie. Midway was very less good at this, but in 1996, 5 years after MK's debut, they sure gave it the old college try. This is the case of the Combat Carbon copies. Now, we're going to need to start off with some additional context. After 1995's Mortal Kombat 3 of both the vanilla and ultimate flavors, Midway was flush with cash, pushing the franchise in just about every direction it could go.
My name is Shang Tsung.
For better or for worse.
Alright.
There was one place it hadn't been yet: the third dimension. Now, 3D had started off with fighting games all the way back in 1993, courtesy of Yu Suzuki. Therefore, the next entry in the series would go kind of 3D with MK4, as well as some baby steps with MK Mythology's Sub-Zero, which was one half 2D, one half 3D, and all frustrating. Around this time, Midway's various studios swelled with more teams, and with the fighting game boom still going on and 3D seemingly looking like the next big thing, they enacted their three-pronged plan. Phase 1 started with 1996's War Gods, which was made by a smaller team within Midway. It was initially thought to be an early test for Mortal Kombat 4, and you could certainly make that argument because it was exactly like Mortal Kombat 4. It had the same control layout, even keeping the block button for some reason. Had uppercuts, sweeps, fatalities, the announcer even straight up says, "Fatality!" It had all of the Mortal Kombats. Its story and characters were also not too outside the MK wheelhouse. An ancient being bringing various warriors, some mystic in origin, together in a fight to the death to claim a bounty of ore, a mysterious substance from the stars that grants ultimate power. Alright, roll call. Anubis, Warhead, Sci-Fi, Vala, Aokin, Tak, Maximus, Kabuki Joe, Voodoo, and the two big green boys, Grox, who's just, he's supposed to be Goro, but he's Grox, and Zior, Izor. He'll be playing your Shao Kahn for the evening. Much noise was made over the game's graphical techniques, including the way they rendered the characters via a bit of a technology called digital skin, which was essentially a photo of an actor, which was then mapped on to the character model. So, yeah. You mean a texture map? Yeah, they actually did have some characters though dress up for some photo shoots, including Mortal Kombat's own Kerry Hoskins, and then recreated them in 3D. MK4 was also going to use digital skin, but then dropped that altogether for reasons we shall see. Now, why did War Gods never catch on? Hype name, violent, plays like Mortal Kombat, and it's 3D, which is like a whole extra dimension. Well, a lot of small things really. It did very little that was new, other than a 3D dodge maneuver, which was novel at the time, and an expanded combo system, giving the War Gods Tekken-like 10-hit strings. The game, while playing like Mortal Kombat, also played slightly clunkier, as this was Midway's first fully 3D arcade game, a stark difference to the fast and frenetic Ultimate MK3. And while fun in a cheesy 90s way, the characters and story didn't really grab hold like the world Ed Boon and John Tobias crafted. Speaking of Mr. Noob, he and the Mortal Kombat team were quick to disassociate from Gods of War. Even 10 years later, Ed maintains that they were never consulted for anything regarding it, and it was handled by a completely separate team. Going back to the game now, however, it's actually a silly but fun little fighter. Playing as mythological gods like Anubis or even close enough parallels like Vala, it's always a neat thing. It's not incredibly deep, but has a certain over-the-top charm that's undeniable. Its PlayStation N64 ports didn't do much to bolster its image, but they did come with fun Midway-like codes and secrets to play as the bosses. You like 90s fighting games in early 3D? Well, you can do worse than War Gods. Undaunted though, the very next year, Midway was responsible for putting out another violent 3D fighter, but they weren't the ones who actually developed it. Atari's lingering arcade division, who had previously put out Primal Rage, were brought under the same banner as Midway when Williams purchased them in late 1996, which led to Midway publishing the next curious curio in our lineup. Mace: The Dark Age was an attempt to marry Mortal Kombat violence and aesthetics to the weapon-based gameplay and time period of Namco's Soul Blade series, which had its first entry in 1995. Mace, however, made it to the arcades almost a year before Soul Calibur would then blow up the scene. Mace and its Dark Age centered around the powerful Mace of Tanis MacGuffin, an immensely intense weapon that was wielded by one Asmodeus, with every selectable character vying to wield it. Arenas were big, rendered in full 3D, and were totally explorable, but don't venture too far, as they sometimes were dotted with hazards that would cause damage to either combatant. This lineup of medieval marauders included Mordos Kull, Koyasha, Namira, Al-Rashid, Ragnar, Takeshi, Sir Dragon, Zhao Long, Taria, the Executioner, Lord Deimos, Hell Knight, Warmech, Ichiro, and of course, Ned and Pojo. And much like War Gods, and therefore much like Mortal Kombat, there was also a sub and final boss. The first was Grendel, taken from the Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf, and then Asmodeus himself, who appears as a multi-armed dragon entity. The camera in Mace was also fairly dynamic, swinging around the arenas to show the action from the best perspective, and the stages themselves were meticulously designed. The music, that leaned very hard into the realm of heavy metal, would still take inspiration from the countries each fighter hailed from. It also looked incredibly impressive in 1997, running on the 3DFX Voodoo arcade hardware, much like Hydro Thunder did, and for a time was one of the best looking games in the arcade, having a distinctive next-gen look. Now, despite all this going for it, fun varied characters, cool graphics, and polished presentation, the game did play rather sluggishly compared to other 3D fighters, and featured a more methodical pace, as well as lacking the same gameplay depth offered by Tekken or Virtua Fighter. Each warrior in Mace had a standard amount of special moves and only one fatality each, this time called Execution.
Execute him!
So it wasn't exactly the type of thing you could keep going back to again and again. Atari Games then fell under the Williams umbrella officially, so Mace would see a competent N64 port published by Midway and GT Interactive. It, however, was criticized for playing even slower and not ideally on the N64 control pad. The graphics and sound also took the expected hit, and a PlayStation version, which was planned and worked on, was cancelled before release. This led some to believe that either the N64 or arcade version itself wasn't a big enough success for Midway to invest in it any further. Now, let's get to the bottom of this. The idea of an edgier, more violent 3D fighter in the vein of Soul Blade should have found an audience. It might be because by 1997 it was hard for new fighting games to make much of an impact, as Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, and all of the SNKs were dominating 2D, while Tekken, Virtua Fighter, and Dead or Alive had 3D on lock. As time dragged on, it was getting harder and harder for new franchises to gain any ground, and as we delve further and further into those 90s, the genre was also just growing less and less with so much competition vying for the players' quarters. Midway, however, were still undeterred as they had yet another fighter in the works, with the exact same strategy: make it 3D, make it violent, and release in arcades and on the N64 and PlayStation. This was 1998's BioFreaks, the freaks of course standing for Flying, Robotic, Enhanced Armored Killing Synthoids. And it's probably the most unique, so close to an actual thing fighter that Midway ever put out. It was also made by a third-party studio who Midway had no investment in, that being Sapphire Entertainment, who had previously handled the home version of Rampage World Tour. BioFreaks definitely had some things going for it. Chiefly, it's one of the earliest examples of the arena fighter, beating other similar games like Power Stone or Wu-Tang Shaolin style to the punch by a few years. Players could navigate large 3D stages with a jetpack, hence the flying, and everyone was equipped with some type of long-range gun attack and a shield to avoid incoming damage. Out of all three titles Midway attempted, BioFreaks also took some risks with the atmosphere and setting, going for a far-off dystopian future ruled by mega corporations, and has one of the coolest intro texts in fighting games.
While the government tried to keep control of the country, the effect of the giant corporations' white-collar wars drove the economy into a tailspin. With Wall Street in shambles, the government bankrupt, and technological corporate giants running unorthodox takeovers, Neo-America was born.
So yes, each flying robotic enhanced armored killing synthzoid was sponsored by a really evil mega corporation, all vying to win the tournament and to crush their competition. This imaginative roster consists of Bullseye, Delta, Sabotage, Minitech, Cycloud, Purge, Zipperhead, and finally,
The God, Emperor SSAPO!
there was also a final boss named Mutilator, which the less said about is the better. BioFreaks let you rip off limbs mid-fight, explode your opponent's head, fall into acid or fire, launch some crazy combos and setups, and each character had a fairly big move list. The futuristic setting and crazy designs gave it an almost Twisted Metal style look and feel, and the music and presentation went a long way into feeding into that. The game unfortunately didn't test well in arcades, as the very defensive nature of the jetpack and shooting gameplay led to many timeouts. So while it was initially tested there and the ROM was leaked, it never got a full widespread arcade release. Both N64 and PlayStation owners got ports, but it was a very no-frills affair, not featuring any additional playable characters, secrets, or modes, which could have been a strike against it. It's really a shame about this one, because unlike War Gods or Mace, BioFreaks was doing something very different, both in terms of aesthetics and gameplay. Sapphire, however, would go on to make similar fighters with both Xeno Warrior Princess for the N64, featuring 4-player brawls, as well as Barbarian on the PS2, which was a much more refined version of the same concept. Still though, like our other two fighting games we've dissected today, Midway just wasn't able to make this one stick. Putting out 3 brand new fighting games in 3 years was probably not the best approach, because each one was eating into the same demographic: violent 3D games in the style of Mortal Kombat. This, in conjunction with all the competition and the popularity of fighting games gradually fading, are all factors as to War Freak Gods, the Dark Age, didn't see the same success as its big brother. It was nice, however, that Midway got progressively bolder, getting more and more unique with each game, and in BioFreaks' case, maybe a bit too unique. But what about today? Well, Mortal Kombat is arguably bigger, but some wouldn't say better than it's ever been, as MK11 is currently the best-selling game of 2019. Its gear system and all of its unlockable costumes and skins, though, well, that leads to an interesting idea. Warner Bros. Wound up buying many of Midway's languishing IPs, most of their back catalog, in fact. Now, in terms of costumes and guest characters, in Street Fighter V, Capcom was pulled from other franchises like Darkstalkers, Captain Commando, and many others for inspiration. Therefore, it would be a real deep cut if Warner Bros. Could dip into the rosters of these forgotten fighters, especially since NetherRealm drops Easter eggs and inside jokes into many of their games. Why not? Why the hell not? You have the platform to do so, so. You feature lots of guest characters, you then recycle out of older guest characters. So how about a Lord Deimos armor set for Shao Kahn, or zipperhead parts for the Collector, and hell, why can't Geras turn into a dog-headed Egyptian death deity? Or how about make them just DLC characters? Just go nuts on it. If not that, then how about a re-release? An HD digital collection featuring all three, and hell, MK4 as well, which never got a re-release anyway. The Midway Fighting Games Origin Collection, 3D. Crazier things have happened. Okay, well maybe they haven't. But I think we got to the bottom of all this, shined some light on each of the game's strengths and weaknesses, and even found a way for these old titles to get a second life. So with that, the case of the Combat Carbon copies is closed. Thanks to Big Boss McShork for sponsoring this video. If you'd like to see your own case file opened up here on the Flophouse, or even an episode of What Happened, head on over to the VIP Patreon to suggest a topic for me to investigate further. See you next time, fellow gumshoes, on the Flophouse Files.